Hi, I'm Rachel, and since I didn't do any weekly AM reading updates in October, I thought I'd do a quick monthly wrap-up now of the 6 books that I read. But I've actually been talking about most of these books a lot in the last few weeks, so I'm hoping that this video will be a little shorter and sweeter than some of my recent ones. Especially now that I'm in NaNoWriMo mode and don't have as much time for all this crazy editing and so forth. Let's keep it rolling here. I had a really good reading month. On Goodreads I gave everything a 4 or 5 stars. It was a pretty diverse month too. I read short stories, I read memoirs, I read what I call literary criticism. We'll get to that later. I read speculative fiction. And I just found it all very moving for various reasons, and I'll go into more detail in my literary newsletter that I'll link down below that I do every month, where I put in segments from each of my Goodreads reviews of these books, and then I have other fun content too, like a book pick of the month and my TBR and a book meme and all that. Anyway, the first book that I read this month was A Basket of Apples, which is short stories by Shirley Faessler. I read this collection of 6 stories pretty slowly because it was around the time that my cat Leia died after a sudden illness. And I found this book was the great one to sort of carry me through that, because I didn't really have the attention span for anything longer than short stories. And yet these short stories were just very full and complex, and I was intrigued by the way that Faessler started all of her short stories basically in the future with her narrator, who was this young girl growing up in the Toronto Jewish immigrant community in the 1920s. And then, well, she started as a young girl and then moved on into an older woman in the later 20th century. And she'd be going through something in her life, but then she'd relate that and backtrack that to the meat of the story that happened in the past with members of her family. The first story, Henya, still speaks to me the most, I believe. It's a story that's told when the narrator is a young girl and she is the caretaker for an elderly aunt who is an immigrant who can't speak English, and is married to this swindler and bootlegger and gregarious guy, and the aunt is relatively this awkward, frumpy nobody, and we flash back into the time in the old country before the narrator was even born, to kind of go into how these two met and courted and got together, and then into their growing relationship. And it's very much sort of a stereotypical beleaguered marriage where it looks like they really hate each other and are pulling on each other, and he's so mean to her and she's so trapped. But as we go through the story and go through the action happening around the time of the bootlegging, when the police are onto this guy, you can tell more complexly about how they really feel about each other, and there's a lot of humor and a lot of warmth, and I thought it was really well done. And so too were the other 5 stories, and I'm really glad that I read this. I think I've said that in every video. This next book I read was a memoir, My Jewish Year, by Abigail Pogrebin. She's a famous journalist. She is a Reform Jew and grew up celebrating most of the major holidays and being connected to Judaism, but there is a lot of other ritual that many of the non-Orthodox do not practice, and she decided that she wanted to connect with some of that so that she would, for 1 year, celebrate all of the Jewish holidays and document the experience through essays in a book. So there's a chapter or 2 for each holiday or fast. And this book was put together by Fig Tree Books, which is a small press that I really like because it's dedicated to the American Jewish experience. And I really love this book because I guess as a progressive Jew myself, it spoke to me and how I think about faith and belief and ritual, and challenged me to do better in that arena. And She went around and found so many different rabbis and scholars from different walks of life to talk to her about the deeper meanings behind all of these holidays and fasts. And she mostly stayed in New York to go to synagogue or other events for each of the holidays, although for Sukkot she was in Southern California, which I can't get out of my head because if you're going to be in an outdoor holiday, what better place to be in? And throughout the book, she picked up on the broader narrative of the Jewish holidays and the Jewish year, about what it tells us about fragility and redemption within aspects of our lives and our practices. And she's a wonderful writer. I thought she put it all together very beautifully, and this was one of my anticipated reads of 2017, and I'm just so grateful that I read it. This was another of my anticipated 2017 reads that I wanted to get to before the end of the year, and I also like this one a lot. And it is a speculative fiction novel called The Wanderers by Meg Howrey. It chronicles a time, I guess in the near future, when a corporation is preparing 3 astronauts to go to Mars for a mission, and beforehand they take them to this simulation in Utah, where basically they're living in the ship and then otherwise have on virtual reality whatchamahoos to, you know, simulate being on Mars as much as they can. And one of the major premises that comes to bear in the story is about dealing with what's real and what's fake, because they're in this confined space for such a long period of time. And the writing style for this is also very character driven. So from the start, Howrey's interested not so much in the science, although the science appears, but what makes these people tick, why they do what they do, what makes them who they are. I thought she had a beautiful, confident writing style, and my main problem with this book is I thought that it could have been a little tighter if she let go of some of the perspectives outside of the 3 astronauts. But otherwise, I found it compelling and beautiful, and I recommend it. This is my final anticipated read of 2017. The books that I highlighted earlier in the year, I wanted to officially get through all of them in October, so yay! This is another memoir called The Book of Separation by Tova Mirvis. She's one of my favorite authors, and this is her accounting of leaving her life of Orthodox Judaism. Kind of like in the Pogrebin memoir, she has essays that go sequentially through a year in her life after leaving Orthodoxy, although she also jumps back into the past to deal with her life within that community. And it's just so rich and complex, because it's not a story about some evil upbringing that she had to escape from. There's ebbs and flows about what she was taught to believe and how it shaped her, and some of it was a little too rigid and a little too narrow-minded, but a lot of it was very moving. And of course she had all of her family in that tradition, and her family was a lot more complex than what many people would think of as a traditionalist religion. And there's just ebbs and flows to life and to journeying and to finding out who you are, and I thought that she explored that all very deftly and movingly, and I was just so grateful to be taken along for the ride, and also to learn more about how she crafted her novels that I love throughout this journey and what they meant to her. So it was a little perk on the side. And it's a complicated book because, you know, obviously you're speaking about other people and people who you've hurt by leaving a certain way of life. And so she uses other people's names, and I really feel like through this book she was not blaming anyone. This was very much centered on her own journey and her own relationship with Judaism and with Orthodoxy. I've just always loved her writing style and her perspective. I feel like she understands complexity and nuance, and that nothing is black and white, good and evil, and so too is her relationship and her evolving relationship with Orthodoxy and with Judaism and with the life that she has chosen for herself next. So basically, I just want her to keep writing. I just hope that she comes out with another book really soon. Next, we have the Women's Torah Commentary, edited by Rabbi Elyse Goldstein. Several months ago I held this up once or twice because for the last year I've been roughly reading it in increments, although I fell off the bandwagon for a little bit just now, but I finally wanted to get this under my belt. These are portions of the Hebrew Bible that we read in services throughout the year, and rabbis give sermons on them. And this one is focused on female rabbis and feminist interpretations. And I found it to be a very compelling journey. I took a lot of notes within the book, although my note-taking changed throughout as well as I grew along with the commentaries. And you know, it's interesting about what each individual rabbi chose to focus on in each of her sections, and sometimes you could tease out minor female characters and wonder more about their lives, or you could look into the complex meanings of Hebrew words that might actually be reinterpreted to be more inclusive, and sometimes you had to move way beyond the literal text and say, okay, how do we make it a metaphor to apply to us now? And then we had Midrash and Talmud, which reminded me how we've been doing this sort of interpretation ever since the beginning of the Jewish tradition. So I found it very affirming in that way. And I just found this to be a great journey. Of course, I agreed with some rabbis more than I did with others, but the journey of it was what was really important to me, and I'm just so glad that I went on it. And the last book I read was an audiobook, so I guess I'll insert a picture up here. It was the second book in the Broken Earth trilogy, which is The Obelisk Gate by N.K. Jemisin. It's a Hugo Award winner, and the third novel, The Stone Sky, I think is priming up to be something similar. I know it just made it onto the nominations for Goodreads Choice for fantasy, so there's that. This is set in a really tumultuous world, which I believe is future Earth. I'm pretty sure we can all agree that's what it is. Way into the future, when there's one supercontinent that is often ravaged by these horrible seasons that really just can destroy humanity unless they're hunkered down in calms, and even then, you know, it's sort of a toss-up whether you survive or not. And I guess in response to that, these people called origines have come up who can manipulate the earth to counter some of the worst weather, although not all of it. And then in this book we get into some deeper sort of magic about what they're capable of. And the main character, Esun, and her daughter Nasun are on two paths where they intersect with people with bigger plans about what they want for the Earth. Because we're entering what might be the final season, and various parties have thoughts about that and are trying to put plans into motion, and Esun and Nasun are both very powerful origins. I think one of the most unique parts of this book is the writing, because Jemisin uses, well, she continues to use second person for Esun, because it was something she used in the first book, and it had to do with her relationship to the other two narrators. And in this book, we ultimately have a person in first person talking to her, so it worked there too. And then in other parts, there's this omnipotent narrator, so that we follow characters, but the narrator tells us things about them and about the world that they can't know. And I find it very intriguing. I guess in a way it's sort of like meta-fantasy, because fantasy in a way has to be about folklore and about mythology and about someone telling us this is the way that the world works, not just lyricism. And she still leaves a lot of room for, you know, questions that we're all pondering together about what's going on with this world. And another thing I really loved is how she dealt with character interactions, because the origins are very much despised, and there's a component of racially charged hatred going on here, and how that affects people and how that affects communities and people's lives. And I'm looking forward to getting the audiobook for the third book. Like a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, I've listened to it on audiobook, and I really like the narrator. I think she does voices so well, and she also narrates action so well. It's really like being on a campfire and somebody telling you this gripping tale. I guess that's the feeling I get with this sort of post-apocalyptic fantasy. It really does feel sort of rustic and old school like that, and I'm really enjoying the audiobook experience. Well, that about covers it for me now. I'm almost positive that went on longer than I was hoping it would, but I hope that my summaries of those books have interested you. And I hope you're all having a great start to November and are enjoying your NaNoWriMo experiences. We're pretty early in, so hopefully we're still very much on the ball. And if not, we have a lot of time to catch up. You can do it. I should be back on Sunday or Monday, and I'll be posting a vlog-type video of my first week of NaNoWriMo, where I talk about my progress and what I've been up to, so stay tuned. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.